And that was me forgetting to record, but there we go. I'm sure we'll be fine. So remember that there's a stimulus. The stimulus is in the environment. That's something around us that's happening, and it's converted into a perception and a psychological experience. So our sensory systems are made up of sensation, which is the process by which our sensory receptions and nervous system receive and represent the stimulus energies from our environment. So it's something outside of us. It's how it comes into our system, okay? Whether it's through the eye and light waves, the sensation could be an object, it could be visual, it could be auditory, it could be taste, it could be anything. That's the actual sensation. And the process by which once it's in our consciousness through neural signals in our brain, that's where we start to organize it and we perceive it and we interpret it. So the difference, understanding what the difference is between sensation as one set of processes and perception as another set of processes. So in our environment are stimuli, many stimuli, and they get converted, that energy gets converted into the neural signals which we spoke about, okay, into our brain through a process of neural signaling. The perception is how we organize or we make sense in our minds and our brains of what we are, the stimulus that we are receiving. So perception can be bottom up. We take all the little pieces and we put them together into a more complex process to see a visual picture, or top down is where we think about, it's something we remember seeing, okay? It relies very much on our memory and our thinking skills, and we interpret it that way. So the two different processes of sensation and perception. So sensory information travels to the brain. We don't pay attention to everything because we would be overwhelmed if we had to pay attention to everything. So we have selective attention, and we also manage to adapt. We have sensory adaptation, which is where we pay less attention to things that don't change. Okay, things that happen in the background of our lives, we pay less attention to, but we pay more attention to something that's different or unique to us. But we all experience, or we all perceive things, we all sense things very differently, okay? We're not all the same. It depends on the function of the individual sensory systems, our individual environments, and again, our own unique contexts and experiences. So everybody is different. Nobody is the same, and there can be reasons why people perceive things differently, or people have different interpretations of their sensory input. So nobody is the same. So you be clear on what those two processes are, how they work together, okay, and that everybody is different. So the important terms, and we did have this in an ICE task, is about how we notice the stimuli in our environment. So what is around us and how do we notice them? Not everybody notices everything. You might see something, but I might not see it, okay, or hear it, whichever way. So the threshold, understand the terms. It's important you understand these terms, is a point at which the stimulus can trigger a response. So at what point does it become visible to us, or at what point do we hear it, or at what point do we taste it? It's like putting more and more sugar in your tea. It might, you said there's not enough sugar, I can't taste the sugar, but at some point you will be able to taste the sugar. That's the threshold. It's the point at which you can trigger a response in your taste and it tastes sweet. Okay, and the stimulus intensity is how strong a stimulus has to be in order to be detected. Okay, so it's that point at which the stimulus can trigger responses, the threshold, and the intensity. You might only need 2 sugars in your tea. I might need 5 sugars in my tea. So the stimulus intensity for me would be, for example, 5 sugars. How strong does it have to be before I detect it? So the term absolute threshold is the smallest amount of stimulus that can be detected for a specified period of time. Okay, so that term is quite straightforward. It's the smallest amount. And the just noticeable difference is the smallest detectable differences between 2 stimuli. Okay, so at what point can you see it? See the difference between 2 colors. They're very close together. very small, just noticeable difference, the smallest difference that's detectable between two things. So just make sure you understand the terms and the concepts. And we had an example in one of our ICE tasks around noticing stimuli in our environment. So there's an example of how you need to apply it. Signal detection, so that's where the personal differences come in. So it acknowledges that there is a just noticeable difference between two things, but it's very much an emphasis on a psychological state that influences the detection. So your personal experience, we've seen a number of times the experience with the housebreaking example, that if you've been through that process or that experience before, you might be more aware to detecting signals, auditory signals of windows breaking or alarms going off. Our biases, what our expectations are, how motivated we are to hear or taste something, our previous exposure, our personal sensitivities to something, how alert we are, the confidence we've got in responding, our personal strengths. So it's all those things that actually make us different in how we detect things, and understand that for the exam, because there was a question last year on players in a soccer match seeing a tackle and why one person would not see the tackle and the one would, or interpret it differently. And it's asking you to apply why people have different abilities to detect various signals. And again, the more signals there are in the environment, the less likely you are to hear one of the signals. Okay, so additional stimuli can make signals weaker. So the more that's going on around you, it confuses certain stimuli and you might not hear them or respond to them, whatever it might be. Perception without awareness, again, it tells us that it's that subconscious perceptions can influence somebody's experience and resistance. So music in a shop, it's playing to your subconscious. You're not in control, or you're not aware of it, but it's perception without awareness. And sensory adaptation, when the stimulation sensitivity gradually weakens due to extended exposure. So getting used to the sound of an air conditioner over a period of time, our senses are adapting. So make sure that you just have a good understanding of those terms. The pieces on the eye, the ear are very straightforward. There's diagrams in the book, and it's more of just understanding the processes by which those happen. But these are the areas like sensation and perception where you would need to apply this knowledge to a case study. So that was an area I thought you guys just need to focus on and make sure you understand. The next section is on the nature of consciousness, and this is where we speak about sleep and the biological rhythms. So again, it's something that we haven't had in an assignment at all, and so just understanding what consciousness is. Consciousness has got 4 components. It's our awareness of things going on around us, external events to us. It's awareness of what's going on inside us, internal things. It's an awareness of ourselves as being unique people, and it's an awareness of how we think about things. Okay, so that's what consciousness is. It's external events, internal sensations, the self is unique, and our thoughts about something. And there's different levels of consciousness, and throughout the day, our levels of consciousness change. Sometimes we are far more aware of things around us, of external events. For example, in the morning, maybe later in the afternoon when we're tired, we are less conscious of what's going on around us. So our thoughts wander. Okay, and we're also sleeping, and that's when our consciousness is dimmed. So in our being, we have different states of consciousness. So we measure those states of consciousness, and I think you should just have an understanding of the different brain waves here. And remember, these are measured by EEGs, which we did a nice section on. That was in our assignment, was we could speak about EEGs, and quite a lot of people chose to speak about those electrical recordings. And so just understand how those different brain waves work. So our gamma waves, which the book doesn't really talk about, is where there's a high brain frequency. We're working hard on solving problems and concentrating. Our beta waves are our mind is relatively busy and active. And as we start to become more restful and peaceful and move into sleep, we have our alpha waves, which are reflective and restful. Our theta waves is where we start to get drowsy, and our delta waves where we move into sleep and dreaming. So just be aware of those different brainwave activities and how they work in terms of our state of consciousness to the point where we're asleep. So we go from being very alert, very awake, solving problems through a whole different cycle of brainwaves to where we're actually asleep. Okay, and that's measured through the EEGs that we have discussed. Circadian rhythms, okay, understand what a circadian rhythm is. It's the 24-hour cycle in our body where we move from being asleep to waking up to being hungry to having a higher body temperature, going to the toilet, being hungry again, and then basically going back to sleep. It's a 24-hour cycle. It's very different to a biological rhythm. A circadian rhythm forms part of a biological rhythm. A circadian rhythm is basically a 24-hour cycle. Your biological rhythm, and I put it on the side there so you can just see the difference, that is periodic natural changes in body's functions or chemicals. So for example, a menstrual cycle in a woman is part of a biological rhythm. The circadian rhythm is a specific focus on a 24-hour cycle. One of the things you could be asked to do is to apply a circadian rhythm in your life, or give an example of how your body works in a circadian rhythm for you personally, being able to apply it to your personal experience. So I think focus on understanding what a circadian rhythm is and what it means to you, and an example in your life. Other questions coming through? It's very quiet. I think sleep is going to be quite important. We haven't done sleep, and sleep is focused in previous year's exams. So I would make sure that you have a good understanding of those two different components of sleep, the non-rapid eye movement sleep and the rapid eye movement sleep, and that understanding that sleep is a cycle that we move through 4 or 5 times in a night, but sleep is broken into stages. So make sure you understand what those different stages of sleep are and the brain waves associated with those stages of sleep. I'd say that's quite an important piece just to be sure on. Stage 1 is when we very first sort of just get drowsy, and start to think that we might be going to sleep, but we're not actually aware that we're sleeping. We can wake up at that point with a fright because we actually don't believe we've been asleep, and understand what the brain waves are in that cycle. Okay. Stage 2 is where we spend most of our night, and that's where our physiological changes take place. Our heart rate slows down, our muscles don't get as tense, our brains are relaxed. We see the sleep spindles in the cycle. So you can see in that middle line there, those little spikes are called sleep spindles. We go asleep to things that are familiar to us, gentle noises. But if something unfamiliar happens, like a door bangs, we would wake up. Okay, that's stage 2, and that's where we spend most of our night. And stages 3 and 4 are sort of our recovery stages. It's our deep sleep. It's our important part of sleep for our physiological and psychological well-being. And that's where we have delta waves. We're properly asleep. And if somebody had to wake us up at that point, we'd be a bit confused as to where we are and what we're doing. In children, it's where growth takes place. And generally that lasts between 20 and 60 minutes. And it's where sleepwalking can take place. So those are the stages of the non-REM sleep, and know that that's different from the REM sleep, which is often called the 5th stage of sleep. And that's where you have the rapid eye movement. Okay, so the brain then, when you are in your rapid eye movement state, it's actually like being awake. It's quite an exhausting stage of sleep. Okay, it gets longer in the second half of the night. The eyes go back and forth under the eyelids. And Also, your heart rate increases, so does your blood pressure, your breathing becomes more erratic and irregular, your sympathetic nervous system is active, it's where sexual arousal can take place, and it's where you awake from having dreams. Okay, and during that time, your muscles are paralyzed because often your dreams are so vivid that it's a protective factor to stop you getting out of bed. So that's where the dreaming takes place, is in that stage. And then from that stage, you'll cycle back to stage 2. You don't go back to that stage 1 where you are just falling asleep. You'll go back to stage 2 again. So you'll cycle between those stages. And obviously, your REM sleep has special benefits. It's important because if you're deprived of it, it's where you get irritable and have lack of concentration. Infants spend longer times in REM. Adults and adolescents spend shorter times. It's important in wiring our brains, and a link to REM sleep and mood as well. Okay, so depressed people have longer REM sleep, and antidepressants suppress REM. So just have a clear understanding of the sleep cycle. I'd say that's quite an important piece for you guys to be aware of. And again, the final part, the final learning unit is on learning and conditioning. So I took this table from the summary section of your textbook, and I find that those back sections where they have the summaries have some very nice representations of concepts and comparisons. So with each chapter, make sure you look at those, because it really does give you a good overview, and make sure that you understand them. So we've spoken a bit in some of our ICE tasks. We did some work around classical and operant conditioning, and also in some of our assignments we've looked at Pavlov and we've looked at Skinner, or some people have. So we have, I think, got an understanding of this, but just being clear on the difference between each one, the description. So classical conditioning, always just have in your head that it's Pavlov, and just have the picture of the dog, and it'll help you remember what classical conditioning is. And operant conditioning is the rats and the Skinner boxes, where he put the rats in. So classical conditioning is a type of learning in which a stimulus acquires the capacity to evoke a response. Okay, and operant condition is where the learning, it's a type of learning in which the responses come to be controlled by their consequences. So rewards and punishment is operant conditioning. Okay, classical conditioning was pioneered by Pavlov, and operant by Skinner. Classical conditioning mainly regulates involuntary responses. So think about Pavlov and the dog. There was no control over the salivation. So it was very much an involuntary response, a reflexive response, whereas operant conditioning is usually around voluntary and spontaneous responses. So there's quite a nice, always think about, they seem to like tables in our questioning at the moment. So, you know, again, a table that compares classical and operant. This is a nice way that a table could be put together with this kind of question. Examples. So understand, they might ask you to think of an example in your life that could be based on classical conditioning. It could be a fear or a phobia. Sexual arousal is also a type of classical conditioning, whereas operant conditioning, a good example, is studying, going to work, telling jokes, asking someone out, or even gambling. So make sure you can understand examples of those two different types of conditioning. Understanding the terminology, very important terminology, and being able to pick those important words out of a question to know that that's what you've got to be speaking about. So terminology and procedures for classical conditioning. Okay, responses controlled through classical conditioning are said to be elicited. So it's like we're drawing out that response. They're elicited. Okay, classical conditioning begins with the unconditioned stimulus that elicits an unconditioned response. So make sure you understand the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. Then a neutral stimulus, so something that has no meaning whatsoever, is paired with that unconditioned stimulus until it becomes a conditioned stimulus that elicits a conditioned response. So have that little picture of the Pavlov's dog, and just know how to go through those different pieces of what it means to have an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. And with operant conditioning, the terms that are used in operant condition is reinforcement. So that's when an event following a response increases the organism's tendency to make that response. So reinforcing through rewards. Okay, we're increasing the tendency for somebody to respond. It's voluntary, and we are purposely engaging with them so that we reinforce that response. Responses controlled through operant conditioning are said to be emitted, whereas remember in classical it was elicited. Demonstrations of operant conditioning typically occur in the Skinner box, okay, where the animal's reinforcement is controlled. And I think you're all good on the Skinner box, but you can refresh it. And the key dependent variable is the animal's response rate. Okay, so how often it responds, how quickly it responds, is the response rate to that conditioning process. Then again, just some words, and again, it's a comparison about the basic processes. So the words that crop up in both of those is the word acquisition. So acquisition is the formation of a conditioned response tendency. So that's like the actual outcome. It's the acquisition when that thing happens. So in a classical conditioning, the acquisition occurs when those two, the conditioned and the unconditioned stimuli are paired, gradually resulting in a conditioned response. Whereas in operant condition, acquisition occurs when a response gradually increases due to reinforcement. So that's acquisition, how those things happen. They're acquired. What is the process of acquisition? Extinction means it's a gradual weakening. So like a species becomes extinct, so can the outcome of this process. So extinction means that when the conditioned response is not eliciting, a conditioned stimulus is no longer exhibiting a conditioned response. Okay, but we do say with conditioning, there's a process of spontaneous recovery where it could come back again. Okay, so extinction means the response is sort of slowing down and starting to not happen. And again, in operant, when the response gradually slows and stops after reinforcement is terminated. So if you stop rewarding a behavior, the behavior might come back, the good behavior might become extinct. Generalization is when the person starts to respond to something that's similar to that stimulus, but it's not the same stimulus. Okay, that's generalization. Like the example with little Albert, where the little boy was conditioned to fear the white rat, and then gradually he started to fear everything white. So white, the color white, was now being generalized across a number of stimuli. And again, with operant conditioning, is increases in the presence of a stimulus that resembles the original stimulus. So you're not responding to the same thing, you're responding to something different, but it's similar. And discrimination is when basically we're not generalizing, so we're not responding to something similar. Okay, we're discriminating it. When responding does not increase in the presence of a stimulus that resembles the original stimulus. So it's sort of the opposite of generalization when we don't respond. So just be aware of what those terms are and how they can be applied in the process of classical as well as operant conditioning. And the last piece of it is the piece on observational learning. So we've done quite a bit around classical and operant. So observational is something that hasn't really come up at all, and it's through learning. Okay, and it's about being conditioned by watching somebody else who's being conditioned, and you start to copy their behavior. You behave in the same way. Okay, and the four processes that are involved in that is attention. You need to pay attention to what's happening around you, or watching somebody go through something, you're paying attention to it. You can retain that information. So in your head, you might create a mental image of what happened to somebody else. So therefore, you might repeat or not repeat the behavior. That you're able to reproduce it, that you actually physically can reproduce that behavior, and that you're motivated to do so. Okay, so it's about watching other people, observational learning. And part of it is the part that I think could come up is something around the issue around aggression and the TV and modeling of aggression. And it asks you to look at the research around Bandura, which is the Bobo doll, that lovely Bobo doll, and where a child sees an adult display aggressive behaviors against the Bobo doll. And again, how can that now in in TV depiction of aggressive adults or aggression or violence on TV, how does that research link to that? Okay. The researchers concluded that a TV depiction of an aggressive adult model was as effective as a live model in increasing aggressive behavior in children. So recent research found that exposure to media violence appears to desensitize people to the effects of aggression in the real world. So observational learning can increase aggressive behavior in children or adults for that matter, but it also can desensitize people to aggression. So it's sort of like a double-edged problem there. So just understand observational learning. So guys, that's just the slides I put through together for you, really just to reinforce and revisit some of those key points. I don't know if anyone's got any more questions. We will have the national support session just now, which I hope you're all attending. Sorry, the two run consecutive. I've put it up today, Cindy. I did send you a message. I put it up for one group, but had forgotten to put it up for the other group. So it's there under recordings, and I did also send you the link on my reply to you, so you should see it. So that is up. What was the example used about the model? You mean the model from this section, the modeling of behavior, Bandura, and the Bobo doll? Okay, so it's in your textbook, and you can also, a Bobo doll, and in my national support session, I've got a picture. It's a blow-up doll that an adult was punched and hit. It's called a Bobo doll, and if you Google Bandura and the Bobo doll experiment and links to aggression, you'll see very clearly what that example, Bobo, B-O-B-O, Bobo doll. It's in your textbook, Bobo. Okay, so it was called a Bobo doll. And it's in your textbook in that section on observational learning and Bandura's research on aggression. So just, I think, have a good understanding of that. So if anybody's got any more questions, you're welcome to ask. Please, you're welcome to also email me at any time between now and when the exam comes. In the NSS, I'll just speak a little bit more about the exam and the type of questions. But yeah, this was really just to refresh our memories on some of the points that we might need help on. So guys, if you're okay with that, I'm going to sign off so I can just upload my slides for the national support session. I have recorded this and I'll pop it up. But again, please just email me if you need help with anything. Okay. I hope that answered questions. I will upload the revision slides. I'm glad you found Bobo Lou. Thank you, Jasmine. All right, so we'll see you just now. You can find Bobo dolls. I'm quite sure if you go to the Crazy Store, you'll find something very similar. I think you'll find something very similar. Okay, so I'll see you just now. I'm going to get my slides ready for the next presentation. Okay, thanks, guys.